your organization has the great name. You got neurohacker.com, but it is named the Neurohacker Collective. Why did you choose the neuro? Why draw that particular circle of emphasis for yourself?
So Neurohacker Collective was born out of a think tank that was working on complex system problem solving for all of the major complex systems at a civilization level. So we were working on future of economics, where the incentive of all agents is aligned with the well-being of other agents in the common. We were working on governance, so better systems of decision making. And we were working on infrastructure to have closed loop infrastructure where there's no waste or need for ongoing unsustainable materials acquisition, etc. And we were working on how do we make sure that we have models that are really adequate for where humanity's going. And once it was time to start building some of these, we've done work in a number of the areas. The reason why we decided to invest a lot in the psychoneurospace early, and we're still working on all of those spaces interconnectedly, but why the psychoneurospace is so important is a couple reasons. One is all the problems that we see in the world that we would want to change, whether we're talking about overfishing of the oceans or biodiversity loss or war or crazy fundamentalism or crime or anything, all these problems are being caused by human activity. And human activity is being predisposed by lots of things. Economics are predisposing it, but physiology is part of what's predisposing it. Everyone knows that when their hormones are really out of place, their neurotransmitters are out of place, that not only do they feel shittier, but they're likely to act differently and different in potentially less good ways. Well, that ends up going all the way to the level of psychopathy. Empathy is mediated over certain neural networks, and it can be up or down regulated. Complex problem solving is mediated over certain neural networks and can be more or less capable. So the hardware that human consciousness and decision making runs on is a big deal.
Yeah.
And so not only are all the problems predisposed by human action, but all the solutions are going to have to come through human action. And so how do we elevate the collective intelligence and the collective experience and positive predisposition of humanity is a bandwidth limiting factor for all critical things. And so working at this level of helping to upregulate human experience and human capability ends up being a very highly leveraged thing to do for everything else. Because then as you take people who want to do positive things and empower them at a hardware level, more positive things get to happen in a distributed, decentralized way. The other reason why we wanted to work on it is because it's very complex. And the more complex it is, the degree to which you succeed there means that those same tools can be repurposed to other things.
What is a specific problem that you would like to solve that you're working to solve now?
We are working on psychoneurotopics. And what we can share publicly is things where we're kind of able to offer direct to people enhancement technologies. Medical technologies obviously have to go through a whole legal process for what it means to clear those as medical technologies, but we're working on the research of it deeply. And so when we're talking about psychoneuro, we're talking about neurodegenerative things and kind of psychiatric things where you have to deal with not only the brain and the nervous system, which is more complex in terms of orders of magnitude of total interactions happening than any other body system, but you also have to deal with the whole rest of the body system in which it's embedded, and you have to deal with the interface with the psyche. Radically harder kind of science, because science doesn't deal with psyches well. It doesn't deal with subjective stuff, so it will only deal with the objective correlates of the subjective stuff, because that's what science evolved to do. And so having to deal with subject-object interface plus the complexity of the objective, we started there because it was an area both where you can alleviate the most suffering, enhance human capability the most, and if you can do well there, you can do well with things that are relatively easy, like cancer and autoimmune disease, and other aspects of human optimization. But so let's take a single example. Let's take anxiety. But I could have just as easily said Alzheimer's or MS or sleep disorders or anything, right?
Sure.
Let's say we're going to take anxiety, which is obviously pretty ubiquitous right now and growingly ubiquitous. Then we say, well, how do we fix anxiety? Well, psychiatric answer has been give a benzodiazepine. This obviously doesn't address underlying cause at all. But in the process of not addressing underlying cause and just saying there's something wrong with their GABA circuitry, let's make a much, much, much stronger GABA receptor agonist exogenously. You exogenously, externally override an endogenous system that you just deemed broken without understanding what was wrong with it.
Yeah.
And then in the process of doing that, create more dependence on that exogenous thing. And then you fix the level of one in-chain chemical, like what's happening at a GABA receptor, independent of the complexity of things it's normally interacting with, which ends up meaning you throw off a bunch of ratios, you throw off a bunch of causal chains, and so you get side effects. So those kinds of single molecule interventions not only don't deal with cause, so the underlying pathogenesis can get worse, but they end up leading to oftentimes increased dependence and side effects. So obviously an adequate approach to anxiety has to understand cause and understand all the possibilities of cause and understand them uniquely in each person, and then have treatments that are customized to all the different things that can go on. And for example, that would look like how much of a particular person's anxiety is psychogenic in origin and how much is physiogenic might be a first question. Physiogenic meaning the origin is primarily physical. Psychogenic meaning the origin is primarily psychological.
If an axe murderer is chasing you, you should be anxious.
Right. And if an axe murderer chased you and you got acute PTSD from that that's continuing to loop, that's very different than, and so now you've got anxiety afterwards from that kind of acute PTSD. That's very different than if you start having anxiety after head trauma, where you actually damage some neural networks, or if you've always had anxiety that's maybe related to genetic predispositions for methylation disorders, or if you got your anxiety primarily after getting a parasite, which caused a gut-brain axis disorder, so your GABA production in your gut is lower, or et cetera, et cetera. So we find that there are thousands of physiologic contributing factors to what we call anxiety, and potentially thousands of different kinds of psychogenic factors. And there's different kinds of psychotherapeutic process and different kinds of medical process and health process that are more effective for different sub-elements. So then you have to say, well, can we map the entire space of things that correlate with anxiety that could be causal? And then can we figure out how to do differential diagnosis across all of them to see exactly which things are going on for this person, which weighted subset of which elements? And then can we map our treatments to the specific pathways, not to the end symptomology? So then which combinations of treatments and which order of operations can all be prioritized and personalized, factoring everything that is known.
Which sounds like you've got to be drinking data from some large streams in order to try to have a reasonable guess based on all those different types of data inputs that you'd want.
Well, so you're looking at, say there was head trauma involved, you've got to have some kinds of appropriate brain scans. Is it QEEG? Is it SPECT scan? Is it et cetera? And how do you get that? Or you might simply look at behavioral scans, cognitive psychoaffective scans that we have found over enough time correlate well enough to a specific kind of trauma. To the degree that it's genetic in predisposition, we've got to be looking at whole genome sequencing and maybe at the level of gene expression, transcriptomics or proteomics. Or to the degree that we're looking at mold toxicity that causes excitotoxicity in the nervous system and anxiety, we have to be looking at the kind of clinical chemistry that gives us toxicity and pathology, right? That's a lot of data. And right now, it's hard to even get it. We don't have high enough sensitivity and specificity on everything, and it's stupidly expensive, and then you can't get it often enough to see what's working. So that's a diagnosis issue. We have to get better and better diagnostic systems. So this is something that we're very focused on, both what's happening at the cutting edge of all different kinds of diagnostics that we can synthesize. How can we help diagnostics get better towards adequate? And then once we have this shit ton of data, the interpretation layer is how do we actually interpret all that data, where you aren't just looking at each biometric in relationship to a reference range, but you're looking at each biometric in relationship to all the other biometrics and psychometrics to see intercausal effects. That's ultimately a kind of AI processing a shit ton of diagnostic data, psychometric and physiogenic data, that then leads to a process where we have to have synthesized all of the treatments that have been vetted as having some efficacy and then relating those down to the pathways over which they have efficacy and then being able to customize. That, though, is a decent baseline description of the future of complex medicine, personalized medicine.
What's that going to look like? Are those data sets going to be publicly available to some extent, or are these going to be developed almost like by rival hospitals or rival medical groups selling access to their own particular live data sets? This is asking you to speculate. Obviously, nobody's got the magic wand here.
Let me go a little bit higher for a minute because the question you asked spoke to it. Medicine within capitalism is broken.